You want to get started? Yes. So, shut. Let it get so right. I'm just there. So, yeah, it's. But right, I had. That was it's my share. Keep that answer.
We get started in about 5 minutes. There is no test, but if anybody wants a copy of the slides and be able to take some notes, it's up at the end of the dais there if anybody wants. You're ruining my joke. I was hoping I was going to be able to start and be like, well, now I know how my FAFSA feels. Everybody's sitting in the back, but now you're front and center. So now I can't. You've ruined my joke.
I love relearning.
That's how you keep things in your face. Well, I'm glad that my lie that it's only going to be an hour fooled you into coming. So we'll see you in about 2 hours.
If my next lot is there anything to break out, or,
You got enough for me? Got enough for me? I'll come over.
Yeah. I'm
there and said that. Yes, however, it is. I don't know. That's all easy.
Yeah, for the board.
Actually, we're 30 seconds short. If they wanted to. Elevator space. That's all about the situation. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. It's over.
Oh, I heard you have this one.
Elaine, did you want?
Sure, yes.
Here from the answer.
What's your name on the top?
I
know what my slides say.
All right. Yeah, very nice. You get an A plus for the day. Gold star. Yep. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Maybe we'll have a few stragglers that walk in here, but I also want to respect everybody's time and try to get you out of here as quickly as we can as well. So see a lot of familiar faces. See a couple faces that I don't recognize. But for those of you who don't know, I am Brian Sadak. I'm the village attorney here for the village, and this is presentation on open meetings law, which is really driven by the fact that we kind of continually get questions both from experienced folks who have heard this presentation or forms of this presentation before, all the way up to new folks that have just joined the boards and commissions here in the village within the last handful of months, even in some cases. So. With that, to kind of start initially with just, why do we care about the open meetings law? And the answer is set for us by the statutes. The legislature says that the fact that representative government really relies on an informed electorate. And so because of that, the policy of the state should be that we have the fullest and most complete information and access to government as we can. That sounds great. It doesn't really necessarily help you folks in terms of why you should care. And I think that the answer to that is that there's a couple reasons why I think open meetings law is important as it relates to our operations and how you operate yourselves when you're on boards and commissions. The first, obviously, is just transparency and public trust. When you do things in open in front of people, that creates transparency. It creates trust in the process, in the decisions that are being made, and it helps ensure that there's some level of trust and accountability as part of the process and what's there. In addition, it allows for public engagement. Certainly, as some of you have heard me say, the statutes don't require, for example, citizen input where the citizens can come in and speak and be part of the meeting in all cases. But just being able to be there, hear the reasoning behind decisions, have that understanding, and then be able to reach out to their elected officials or their volunteer officials on boards and commissions, helps ensure that there's appropriate levels of public engagement. Consistency and clarity is another big factor for the board. It helps everybody, both the members of the public and the members of the bodies, to understand that, hey, we know that, here's what the agenda is and what should be on the agenda, and we understand how that operates. It helps ensure that there's clarity in terms of, what's going to be discussed, how it's going to be discussed, and those types of concerns. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, at least for those of you in the room, is that it prevents law violations. At the end of the day, each one of you is tasked with complying with the open meetings law. And obviously staff and myself and my office are here to help as best we can to help you not violate the law and provide guidance. But the law says that at the end of the day, it's the individual members that have that responsibility to make sure that you are operating in compliance with the law. And so if there is a violation, it's not my office that gets a call. It's not the clerk's office that gets the call, but instead it's you directly that gets the call from the district attorney that says, hey, we've got a complaint. We'd like to investigate and talk to you a little bit about it. So having an understanding of the various provisions becomes important for that reason alone for the folks in this room. What does that mean in effect? Statutes also provide for us that meetings of government should be reasonably accessible and also that they should be open to citizens at all times. So what does that mean? Reasonably accessible means that you're holding it in public places. People are able to show up and participate. You are doing things in locations that make sense. Fortunately, very few things that the village does, warrants anything that's much bigger than this room. But certainly as you look at history of things within the area, some of you may recall that during COVID, or actually I guess it was just before COVID, the city of Wauwatosa had the big brush up with the police officers and everything that was going on there. They ended up holding meetings at the football stadium. And set up a stage, up, kind of on the field and had the whole bleachers full of people. And so sometimes that's what reasonably accessible means when you know that there's going to be, 1,000 people that are going to have interest and be, part of the process. You have to plan for that and to do things. It also comes into play when, we talk about site visits. You hear occasionally on like Board of Appeals, for example. We'll want to say, hey, we'd like to go check out the site that we're talking about. And sometimes that can happen, but there's process and rules that go into place with how you deal with that, again, to ensure that there's that accessibility. Statute also says that the open meetings law is to be liberally construed, which is just really a fancy way of saying that if the courts have a question of how to interpret what the requirements of the statute are, the courts are directed to make that determination in the way that is most positive or most favorable to the open meetings and open access to the information that's there. And so as a result, if there are questions or if there are ever doubts, you're always going to default to the side that says what gives the public the most access to a meeting. So what is the actual requirements within the statute? Statute is pretty clear. It just talks about the fact that every meeting of a governmental body must have public notice and is held in open session. Seems to be pretty simple and straightforward, but we're going to kind of key in on a couple of those terms here today for the bulk of the remaining time. And that is to talk a little bit about what a meeting is. We're going to talk a little bit about open sessions versus closed sessions. We're going to talk about notice. And then we're also going to talk about what exactly a governmental body is. And actually, we're going to do those in reverse order. So in terms of what constitutes a body, and I should say, I forgot to start with this. If you have any questions as we go along, feel free to just jump in. We'll certainly have time at the end as well to answer questions, but sometimes it's easier to just do it, as we're talking about the particular topic. But in any event, what constitutes a body? Obviously, for your purposes, the body that you are a part of here, the reason why you got the invite to come to the meeting, I mean, that is a body. It's typically something that's created by the Constitution, the statutes, an ordinance, a resolution, something that formally establishes some body of government that's there. We also talk about subunits of those bodies. So if you have, for example, the Economic Development Commission, I know, was looking at it. Economic Development Commission is one body. They look to create some subcommittees at a time to handle some particular tasks that they were looking at doing. Those subunits are bodies for the purposes of the Open Meetings Law. The one that I really wanted to highlight, just because it's obvious what a body is for our purposes here, but a lot of you are part of civic organizations and other professional organizations, and really where you potentially run into problems that would be outside of this is the kind of catch-all, which is the quasi-governmental organization, and that's built into the statute. Quasi-governmental organization is basically an organization that kind of looks like government. And so what the case law talks about is that it's kind of a reasonableness standard where they're going to look at all of the factors of what's going on. So does the particular organization receive government funding? Does it function in some way that's similar to other public functions? Does it appear to be a public body to the public? Can certainly be a factor. Is it subject to government control? Sometimes you'll have ordinances or statutes that say you must operate in this particular way. That could do that. The degree to which the government bodies have access to the entity's records certainly plays a role. So, examples of quasi-governmental bodies that many of you may be familiar with would include things like M7, which is a development group based here in Southeast Wisconsin in the Milwaukee region. Economic Development in Washington County, likewise, is a quasi-governmental agency in terms of what's there. And so those are the types of things that we see, but it doesn't have to be just development related. Those are just two examples that I can point to that people tend to know. So. Second topic, go back again. Every public meeting needs to be provided notice. The statute, just simply says that the time, place, and subject matter of the meeting has to be publicly noticed and published. That notice typically has to be at least 24 hours before the meeting. That's put in place, and what the courts talk about with respect to how it's an effective notice or not is the bulk of the case law centers around that phrase in the statute that you see on the screen, that the subject matter has to be disclosed in a way that's reasonably likely to appraise the members of the public and news media of what it is that you're going to be talking about. That's usually where the rub is, or where the court cases talk about. What the court cases tell us is that when it comes to that question, there's no bright line rule. There's nothing that says this qualifies or this doesn't. But instead, they're going to examine all of the various relevant factors to try to make a reasonable conclusion. So things like how hard is it for the government to have published a notice that would have provided appropriate level of detail? Whether or not the subject is of particular interest within the community, which I guess suggests that something that's really boring and nobody cares about, you don't need as much detail on, but nonetheless a factor that the courts have identified. Whether it involves routine or non-routine action, something as simple as approving a renewal alcohol license on a year-over-year basis, maybe warrants a little bit less detail, than some unique license that's being applied for and being considered. What the courts do tell us, though, is ultimately the demands of specificity should not thwart the efficient administration of government business. And so there is kind of a balance that the courts look at. So what does that mean? At the end of the day, again, each of you is potentially subject to violations if you attend a meeting that doesn't have appropriate notice that's part of it. And so a good practice for all of you when you look at your agendas to say, hey, is this a good agenda? Is this something that I'm comfortable meeting on to talk about things? Is really to just return to your grade school training. You all remember the 5W questions, maybe? Who, what, where, why, when? You should be able to answer those questions when you look at the agenda. Typically, I mean, the who, Germantown Village Board. Where? Village Hall. Pretty simple stuff. The when, typically your agenda is going to have a time on it. The what becomes ultimately the rub. And so you should be able to look at the agenda and say, hey, I have a general idea of what it is that this agenda item is supposed to be talking about. And if you're able to answer that with reasonable certainty, you've got a pretty good agenda. The one thing that isn't real easy to answer on an agenda is the why. You could probably do that, but your agendas would be, hundreds of pages long in some cases. So not typically a question that we look to answer on agendas, but certainly the other W questions are things to.
Gone through that meeting. Each individual trustee or will be.
Sure. So I'm just going to repeat that because we are being recorded and maybe folks didn't hear. But basically the question is that we had a time fairly recently where we had to basically not meet, the village board didn't meet because of a posting issue. It didn't get posted in the required locations. And the question was, who is ultimately liable or responsible for, that potential violation if the meeting had gone ahead and there was a meeting. The answer is that there could be two levels of potential impacts to meeting in that way. The first would be certainly anybody that was part of that meeting could be subject to the district attorney saying, hey, you violated the meetings, here's your forfeiture. That, in my experience, would be pretty unlikely in that case. What is probably more likely would be that actions that you've taken at that meeting are void, that they just don't have any actual legal effect. And so, it opens, if you had approved a contract at that meeting, for example, the parties to that contract wouldn't need to abide by that contract because it wasn't approved in an appropriate way. If we had approved a development proposal, if they continued with that development, it would be subject to, a neighbor, opposition group, for example, challenging that decision and saying, hey, you didn't get the appropriate decision. So, that's probably the more likely result of that circumstance. But it certainly could be that individual fines would be in place. But I think it would have to be pretty egregious, probably repeated instances of that taking place before the district attorney probably worries himself with that particular violation. So. That kind of covered those first two topics, which were pretty easy. Here's where the bulk of what we need to talk about really comes in, which is what constitutes a meeting and issues that relate to that, and then we'll talk about the open and closed session process to kind of close the discussion. So, what constitutes a meeting? By statute says that a meeting is the convening of a governmental body for the purposes of exercising the responsibilities, authority, power, or duties of that body. Statute further says that if one half or more of the members of a body are present, that gathering by statute, by law, is presumed to be for the purposes of exercising those responsibilities. And so, in other words, anytime you have at least a quorum of your membership present at a location, the courts will presume that that is a meeting that is designed to handle those things. Now, the last sentence of the statute is somewhat critical. It talks about the fact that it doesn't include a social or chance gathering or a conference that everybody would go to that's intended to avoid this chapter. So a really great example is this presentation this evening. This is not, in my estimation, a meeting under the statute because none of you are here to exercise the actual responsibilities or authority of your particular body. We're just here to learn about your rights and responsibilities under the open meetings law. And so this is not a meeting. We didn't publish it as a meeting, but we did provide notice that all of you are going to be here because it may nonetheless constitute that presumption that there's more than half of some bodies that are here. And as a result, the statute would say that that's deemed to be a meeting. The way we rebut that presumption in this case is by putting the notice out there and saying, hey, this isn't a meeting. We know everybody's going to be there, but we're not here to undertake any business of that particular body. And so that's one way that you can do it. Similarly, you're all at the a chamber event, for example. Same thing there. You're all there, you're all present, but if you're not there undertaking, actual business, there's the ability to rebut that presumption to say, well, it's a chamber function, it's for the public good, those types of things. The challenge, of course, being is that when you're in those circumstances, you can't talk about business. You can't do the things that you otherwise might do at a meeting because then it does become a meeting. And so, you being present and together isn't a problem as long as you're not talking about the responsibilities or authority of your particular body that's there. When it comes to how we define a meeting, there's a case, the Showers case, which really kind of sets two standards for when you have a meeting. The first of those tests or standards is that there must be purpose to engage in governmental business. So for the most part, that's pretty obvious. We want to approve a contract or we want to, consider the, appeal of somebody that's looking for a variance at the Board of Appeals, or we've got a loan application that's going to the Economic Development Commission, or, whatever the case may be. Doing that business is pretty obvious. That's a reason to do it. There are other things that bodies do that are not necessarily as obvious that potentially create problems. The Badke case that we see on the screen is a perfect example of that. The Badke case involved members of the village board in the village of Greendale that all showed up, well, not all, but most of them showed up at the meeting of a plan commission meeting because there was a highly contentious development that was being proposed, and they all wanted to be at the plan commission meeting for the purposes of trying to figure out, hey, what's going on? They wanted to get a better sense of what specifically was being presented. Mr. Badke ended up suing, and What the court said in that case is that information gathering is one of your responsibilities as a member of a governmental body in most cases. Certainly at the village board level, and also true at some other, lower level boards and commissions as well, that you are gathering information that you potentially are going to use to make a decision that you're going to be presented with at some point. And what the Badke case says is that, look, if you're going to be there, that's fine for the purposes of information gathering. You're not necessarily going to take any action. You're not going to approve the development that night, for example. But the members of the public should have been aware of the fact that this must be important enough that all of you are going to be there, that we should provide notice to the public that you're going to be there. It cues them into the fact that, hey, maybe this is a meeting you need to pay attention to. And so as a result, you see, the Badke case being implemented in various ways, within the village. So one of the ways that we handle the Badke case is what we just talked about. We provided a notice here today that all of you were going to be here, and it may be a quorum of a particular body, but it's just for the purposes of gathering the information that we're looking at here. The difference, of course, being that you're not going to use anything that I'm giving you here today to make a decision as part of your governmental responsibilities. Similarly, you'll see at the bottom of a lot of our agendas that members of other bodies, will be listed, that they may be present. They're not going to take action, but they may be present. And so you see that being there. My recommendation has always been, and those of you who have been around long enough have heard me say, my recommendation always is that if you are going to go to another body that isn't your own, for the purposes of gathering information about something that you might ultimately have a responsibility or be faced to deal with in some way, is to just let the clerk's office know that, hey, I'm going to be at that meeting. Now, a lot of our agendas have everybody covered, and so it doesn't change anything, but some of our agendas don't have that, kind of at the bottom as standard. And so where you're going to do that, if you let the clerk's office know, then we know that we have to go ahead and publish that notice. Publishing notice is easy. It's just putting it at the front door of the building here, over at the library, putting it on the website, and that's all we need to do. Not super difficult in terms of how you do that. So if you are going to do that, I continue to suggest, whether we ordinarily have it at the bottom of that meeting or not, let the clerk's office know, just so that they can kind of keep tabs of what's going on. It helps us if we do get a complaint to verify, what's been going on. Second part of the Showers test is that there has to be sufficient members to determine the body's course of action. And again, course of action means, like the obvious, we're going to approve a contract, we're going to approve a development, we're going to grant a community loan, or recommend approval of certain actions. We're going to take action on an appeal for a variance at the Board of Appeals. We're going to consider the tax objection for the Board of Review. We're going to consider appointing a new chief or hiring new firefighters for police and fire commission members that I see in the room. All of those things are pretty obvious in terms of what course of action might be. The key is that you have to remember that not taking action sometimes is action as well. And so having members together that block action can be, in fact, dictating how that body is going to take action as a whole. With respect to this, quorums becomes kind of the key thing. Quorum, for those of you, I think probably all of you know, is just basically the number of people that need to be present in order for that body to take action. In nearly every case in the village, with the boards and commissions, that quorum is just basically 50%, rounded up. Usually we have odd numbers, so you end up with a half person, and so you have to round up to that next person. So for example, if you have a seven-member body, split that in half, that's 3.5. So you would round up to 4, and 4 becomes your quorum. So as long as you have 4 people that are present at the meeting, you have a valid quorum to take action as part of that. The interesting things arise when, there are instances where less than a quorum is in some way gathering or partaking in some activity that potentially dictates the course of action of a body. And there's two instances where we see that take place. The first is what is called a walking quorum. A walking quorum, in very short explanation, is a group of meetings that take place that are all less than a full quorum, that are designed ultimately to coordinate some action of the whole group or of the full body. So critical component of the definition that the Showers case gives us is that there has to be that level of express or tacit agreement to act uniformly in order to be a walking quorum. So what does that mean? We'll pick on a couple of the members of the village board that I see here. Let's just say, for example, we had a contract to renew legal services, and we wanted to talk about that. And Trustee Pieper here, really thinks that I'm doing a terrible job, which is why she's sitting in the front row and making me feel very awkward because she's the only one there. But she wants to let it be known that she thinks that we should replace me and somebody else should be the village attorney. And she then in turn goes and talks to Trustee Baum, who's sitting behind her, and says, hey, I think we should pick somebody else to be the village attorney. That's a great idea. And here's why, and talks about that. That conversation in and of itself isn't necessarily problematic, at least for the village board, because the two of them together can't take any action. They can't block any action of the village board. And so that's okay. Trustee Pieper then can also go to Trustee Miller and say the same thing. Hey, Trustee Miller, just want you to know I think Brian needs to be replaced. And here's the reasons why I think that he should be replaced. And when that vote comes up, I'm going to vote no. And that conversation likewise is perfectly acceptable. And that could happen all the way across the village board. She could talk to every other member of the village board in that way without any problems, provided that it's just that sharing of, hey, this is my thoughts. This is what she should do. The walking quorum comes into place when it starts gathering the momentum of what's going to take place. So in that initial conversation, she and Trustee Baum talk, and they both agree that, yeah, no, Brian really needs to be replaced. So they say, yep, that's what we're going to do. And then she goes to Trustee Miller and she says, hey, Trustee Miller, Brian should be replaced. I was just talking with Trustee Baum, and he's agreed with me that we're going to vote no, and we think that you should also vote no. You're starting to coalesce that group to say this is the action that we're going to take. The problem for the members is that you have to be obviously somewhat careful when you have those conversations, because you're putting some level of trust in the person that you're talking to, that they're not then going to turn around and do it in an improper way. And so what I mean by that is that Trustee Pieper and Trustee Baum can have that decision and agree that they're going to vote no and that they want to get rid of me. And she can then go and have that same conversation with Trustee Miller. What she can't do is share the discussion that she had with Trustee Baum with Trustee Miller with the intent of trying to coalesce that decision that ultimately takes place. And so that really is, when we talk about walking quorums, the key component, which is, those individual groups, but that otherwise agreement or tacit agreement to say, yes, this is the action going to potentially take. And that, is where you then get in the trouble is where you have that agreement that takes place. The other example, and it's somewhat related, is the concept of a negative quorum. Negative quorum is something different than a walking quorum. But they're related in that, again, it's something less than the full body that's agreeing to take some collective action that's there. A negative quorum, by definition, is just the number of members of a body that's necessary to block action or to defeat a proposal. So
using, a simple, kind of again example. If you have a body that's 7 members, we've already established that a quorum of that body is 4. And in that circumstance, you could have up to potentially 3 members that could agree to say, hey, we're gonna vote to get rid of Brian, without necessarily any problems if all
members are present and voting, because 3 members can't do anything. It takes 4 members to pass an item. If you had an even number, let's say we had a 6-member body for some reason, if you had a 3-3 vote, a 3-3 vote fails. And so you could potentially block action. And so, what you're always looking at is can that group, that group of individuals in some way stop the board or body from taking any particular action. The problem is that we don't know, and it's not defined in statutes, and it's not defined by the courts yet, that we don't know how to calculate a negative quorum. And what I mean by that is that there's 2 ways of really calculating it. The first is what I've just described, where you have the 7 members, you have 4 members that are the quorum, and so as a result, you can have 3 members that talk, because if all 7 members are voting, the 3 of them can't dictate the course of action for the body, and so they technically could communicate and talk without any problems.
the open meetings law. The other way that you would calculate it potentially is that you do it based on the actual number of members that are voting. So if we use that same 7-member body, and you assume that 1 member is maybe out of the country and isn't able to participate and can't vote on a particular item. In that case, then those same 3 members that were fine under the initial approach now can block action. They can stop any action from being taken, because if it's a 3-3 vote, it's a tie vote and that particular action fails. And so in that circumstance, under a negative quorum, you then with 3 members have a potential violation of the open meetings law. Now, I've often said that like, I don't know what the right answer is. I've always said that we should always base it on the assumption that the courts are going to look at how many people actually voted when they're making that determination. And so, you
always want to be a little bit careful. And we're going to talk in a moment about what careful means in this case. But I think we do have at least maybe an indication of how the courts at least default think about it. There was a case in 2018 that came out of Dane County. Dane County, for those of you who don't know, has an insane county board. It's like 38 members or something like that. Just a lot of people on the particular board. In that particular case, there was a development proposal, and one of the members of the county board had been communicating by sending letters to various, his fellow county supervisors, saying, kind of the same thing that we talked about. Hey, this is a terrible idea or a good idea. I don't remember which one it was in this case, but basically throwing out the idea that hey, this is my thoughts on the particular matter. And after the vote came down and his particular side lost the vote, he had sent an email to somebody that basically said, yeah, sorry, it's terrible that the result turned out this way. We lost a few people that I thought we had, under the suggestion that there was, again, that coalition of groups that had gotten together. Now, the court in that case wasn't asked specifically to opine on, hey, is this a walk-in or a negative quorum issue? That really the court was focused more on the idea that he was just having those one-way conversations. And the court in that case said, hey, those one-way conversations are just fine. We've kind of okayed that in other instances previously in various ways. And so because they were just one-way communications, everything is good here. But the court had to deal with the fact that this email said, hey, we lost some support along the way. And the court didn't really know, I think, how to necessarily deal with that because the parties themselves didn't really present it in a way that made any sense to the court. But so what the court ultimately says in that case is that they did the analysis of effectively whether or not these individual communications that he had otherwise constituted a walking quorum. And when they did that analysis of, hey, did it actually impact the vote or not, is effectively the question they had. When they did that calculation, they did the calculation based on how many people actually voted on that particular matter. And it was, something less than the full board at that point. And so at least, from the default perspective, I think that we see at least one of the Court of Appeals districts, and there's 4 in the state, and so the others may have different opinions as well. But at least one of the districts has said, hey, we think that the default way that you should do this is based on how many people actually were present and voting as part of that. And so when you think about that, that creates a really interesting conundrum, which is if we again go back to that same 7-member body, 4 members are a quorum, that's the minimum that you need to have in order to have a meeting, a valid meeting, and take action. That would mean that just 2 members of that body getting together potentially could block action in that case that only 4 members are present. And so that gets you to, and I've had this out before. It's the same thing as in the back of the handout that you have. This is a chart that I've often put together and shared in the past that just gives you, what I kind of consider to be the magic numbers for each of the boards and commissions here within the village. And what you see is the chart lists the particular body, and then it talks about the voting members, and then based on those voting members, what the maximum and minimum number of people that could potentially get together and talk outside of a meeting without violating the open meetings law. Recognizing again that those same, even if you went with the maximum number, you still can't then take that little small group and go to another group and do a walking quorum where you're gathering that input. But the 3 of you individually could talk on your own without an issue, for example, when it comes to the village board. So the 2 numbers that we have, the maximum number reflects the maximum number based on the full membership of the body. That is the kind of standard way that a lot of my fellow practitioners across the state, I will tell you, look at this, that I've heard them say that's the right way to calculate it. It's just based on the full membership. You always just have to assume that it's going to be the full membership, and so that's okay. And so it may be that you could get away with, in the case of the village board, 4 of the members getting together outside of a meeting and talking without any particular problem, because that, based on the math, is all that works. On the other hand, if you take the more conservative approach, there it tells you that no more than 2 of you should get together, because again, with 9 members, if you do the math, if you get that 3rd member, you're potentially then blocking action of the village board on that bare minimum quorum that was getting together to meet. I can't tell you which one to use. I can recommend to you that you use the minimum number. And the reason for that recommendation is that that's the number that I know that if the district attorney calls and says, hey, I have this complaint, I'd like to talk to you. And if you come to me and I say, hey, I got this complaint, how do we deal with it? And I say, well, how many people did you talk to? And you say, I followed the minimum column. Then I can go and I can talk to the district attorney and say, you're insane if you think this is a violation, because there is no possible way that this is a violation, and it goes away. I can't necessarily do that with the maximum number because I don't know how the court for sure is going to analyze that specific question when they're presented with it. And they just haven't been presented with it. So the question again, yep. Yep. So the question was, how do you effectively deal with vacancies on a body? So if you have the plan commission was the specific example, but it could apply to anybody. If you had a vacancy there, and so instead of the traditional 7 members, you only had 6 members that were actively present. How do you deal with that? Does it change the numbers? And the answer is that it unfortunately depends on the particular body. And the rules that dictate how they are addressed. There are some bodies by statute that say that you always base quorum on the full membership. And so the fact that you have a vacancy doesn't mean anything. But there are other bodies where that requirement isn't in place. And then it's typically been my advice that you base the quorum on the actual members of the body that are actually appointed and holding the office. So a true vacancy doesn't, that would adjust it at that point. But that would have to be like a true vacancy. Like you had somebody that was in office, moved out of the village or died or, something like that. Just being generally unavailable wouldn't count in that particular case. But it unfortunately would be a case by case basis, just, depending on what the statutes or the rules governing that particular body would be. And then you see at the bottom of the charts as well, a couple of discussions of some of the unique situations that we have here in Germantown. So for example, the Utility Advisory Committee actually has something that's different than what would be a typical quorum as by code. The other thing that's not reflected in this, but that you always have to be potentially concerned about is that there are some things that require a higher level vote by either statute or by local code. And in those cases, having that higher required vote is going to change those numbers as well. The 2 examples that I immediately think of, one we don't deal with anymore, but it was an issue, was when we had protest petitions, when the statute still allowed us to have them. If you had a valid protest petition that required a higher level vote in order to pass, that would have changed the numbers. The other one that we do see on a regular basis is budget amendments. Budget amendments require something more than a simple majority in order to pass a true budget amendment. In that case, obviously, the fact that that vote requires a higher number is going to change those numbers as well. So.
Taking your example on page 7, one trustee has individual conversations with 2 other trustees. That same trustee goes to a 4th trustee and says, I'm voting no on this, and I know 2 other trustees feel the same way.
That exactly, I mean, that is, well, let me step back. The question was giving an example of with a negative quorum, if you had a 7-member body, you had 2 folks, 1 trustee that had gone to 2 other trustees to talk about their particular points of view, and then went to the 4th trustee and said, hey, I'm going to vote this way. And oh, by the way, I also know that 2 others are going to vote that same way as well. That's where, when I talked a little bit about the fact that you really have to put faith in the folks that you're talking about comes into play, because in that case, each individual of the first 3 group may not have had the intent to coalesce that particular action and to say what's going on, but that one trustee looping in that 4th one and saying, hey, we're all in agreement, you should come along with us effectively, becomes that tacit level of agreement that potentially the courts could look at as that negative quorum and a problematic circumstance. And so you really do have to have a lot of faith and trust in your fellow body members when you're dealing with that kind of circumstance and situation. And we're going to talk about other examples where that comes up here in a moment. But I saw Tom, I think, had a.
But in that case, would it be like critical that if members are in the same place, they're not talking any business or that particular board?
Correct. Now, obviously, in the case of the Administrative Review Committee, I mean, they have a very limited function. Basically, when an appeal of certain nature gets filed, then they have to discuss it. And so there isn't like you know, like with a village board or with a school board, you know, like there's lots of policy things that are going to come up and, you know, hey, we should talk about this and think about this. Like you're not dealing with that at the administrative appeal board. So there's very little things that they would potentially have to talk about that would be business related unless, you know, there wasn't a pending application that was, you know, before them, for example. And so typically that's what you see is in those smaller number, you know, bodies, you know, they have very specific tasks and duties that are there. And so it's the idea that they would even have business outside of that to talk about is probably pretty rare. But yes, I mean, otherwise, you know, those members, if they had a pending application before them, should not be meeting outside of a public, you know, publicly noticed meeting to say, hey, this is what I think about this application, and you know, how are we going to deal with it? Because that's where the problem comes in.
It's correct to say part of the administrative appeals board discussing a topic, something that has been voted on already. As them to do, that it has already been voted on and passed or denied.
So the question, and I think I forgot to repeat Tom's question as well. Tom's question was just, you know, how do you deal with very small bodies? And you know, if just, you know, the Administrative Appeals Board, which has only 3 members, you know, 2 members then couldn't ever be anywhere to talk. And again, the answer there was that they probably don't have any business to talk about, and so it's probably okay. The follow-up question was, you know, how do you deal with, you know, effectively past decisions that have been made? And I think that question applies not only to the Administrative Appeals Board or small bodies, but certainly anybody for that matter. And I think that the answer to that is, in general, things that you no longer have any responsibility or authority for are not part of your business, and so you're able to talk about those things, you know, freely under the open meetings law, recognizing that there may be some things, especially at the high, you know, the bigger the policy level boards, that sometimes talking about decisions that you've made are then setting policy discussions in motion that may come, you know, at a future point, which are within your responsibility. So I think you have to be careful with that, but there, you know, certainly, I mean, on a one of type thing, you know, once it's done and you don't have any authority that's there, you know, you're okay talking about that in general, I would say.
Consideration.
The question was, how does the motion to reconsider play into that? Yes, it absolutely does, and I think that that's the caveat, I guess, to the answer, which is that you have to make sure that it's done. You know, so, you know, should you, you know, immediately, you know, you finish the, you know, the Board of Appeals, for example, you know, here's a request for a variance, they make a decision on the variance, and then they go out to the bar and they want to drink together and they talk about, hey, you know, can you believe that guy? I mean, you know, there was no way he was going to get that variance, and they talk about it, right? Um, that doing it immediately after the meeting like that, you know, where you're, you know, you literally just got done, is probably not a smart idea, because you could have, you know, circuit court appeal of that decision where the circuit court says, hey, we think you screwed up somehow, and so we're going to send it back to you to do it right. And so you're still going to do it. You could have a motion to reconsideration in some cases, which is only valid on the next, you know, regular meeting. And so I think you do need to be mindful of the fact that what you think is done may not truly be done, but you know, for, you know, the Administrative Appeals Board, which meets once every like 80 years, you know, if they have a meeting, and then, you know, 3 years from now they want to, you know, they run into each other and say, hey, can you believe that thing? You know, I can't believe that's what we had to deal with. You know, that's clearly okay. You know, doing it immediately after in some cases may be a little bit more problematic. Kind of gave the highlight. There are a couple other instances where the thing that Chris was just talking about in terms of having that trust with your fellow body members comes into play, which really is electronic communications. Electronic communications have totally changed the analysis on how a lot of us look at open meetings violations, which is to say that what once was, when I type up a letter and pop it in the mail and send it to each of the individual trustees to express my one-way decision, or thoughts, that's a very slow and methodical process. And even if they're replying, there's some time that takes it, it's not like what you would see at a meeting where it's a back and forth, conversation and interaction. Um, Electronic communications change that. It's very easy for members to send emails back and forth or send text messages back and forth in a way that looks very much like what would otherwise happen in public at a meeting. And so, I think that you need to be mindful when you have electronic communications that you are potentially running into walking quorum type issues, just because you don't control it in some ways. If you and I are texting back and forth, if I then take our conversation and forward it to two others and say, hey, this is what Chris thinks, and we should all go along, now, even though you didn't necessarily intend it, you've been looped into that concept of a quorum. Now, are you in that case going to suffer any particular penalties or violations? Probably not unless they can establish that you knew I was going to do that. But what it does do is that if you feel really strongly about an issue, and you end up being on the winning side because of it, that could be overturned by the courts because of the illegal, coordination that was taking place. And so there may be impacts to you that you don't like because of that. And so I think you just need to be very careful. That's why you see, like, when we send out things, to the village board, for example, hey, here's this attachment that came in, or something else that we think you need. You'll see typically, we put right at the bottom, remember, don't reply all to that message. Because when you do that, you're creating that potential for that walking quorum that takes place. And so, you try to do that, try to reserve, any like back and forth, any deliberations for a publicly noticed meeting, where there's members of the public that are there. So. With that, I'm going to close here with just a couple discussions about closed sessions. Closed sessions, of course, are permitted by the statute. Statute's got a list of a handful of reasons why anybody could potentially go into closed session. But what the statutes also tell us is that these closed sessions, should be when you're looking at, do you qualify under the statute, you're going to be very strict with that interpretation of whether or not you qualify or not. Again, the public policy being that the most open and transparent as we can be, the better. But nonetheless, there are reasons that governments need to go into closed session, and it's really pretty typical. But because of that, there are strict procedures for doing it. You have to start in open session, and then you have to, basically make the announcement that you're going to go into closed session. We do that here typically by the chair of the body. So, President Soderberg, when it's the village board, will read the language that we put on the agenda to, provide the required notice to the public that we're thinking about it and the reasons. So, if we're going to go to talk about an employment issue, for example, he's going to read the provision that says, hey, we're going to go into closed session under 1985 1C for the purposes of considering employment, compensation, promotion. Forget the exact language, but the general language that allows you to go into closed session for those particular purposes. And then you have a vote, and that vote has to be recorded on a roll call basis. Then you're done. One question that does occasionally come up is what happens if I don't think that we should go into closed session? Like, I don't agree. I don't think it's a valid reason to go into closed session. That's why we record the votes. So what the law says is that if you don't agree with the fact that you should be going in closed session, what you should do is first identify, hey, I don't think we should go into closed session for X, Y, Z reasons, and then you vote no. And then as long as you do that, you are free to go into that closed session because you can go and follow the body. But if the district attorney comes calling and saying, hey, you guys violated the open meetings law because you shouldn't have gone into closed session for that reason, you would be the only one that would be excluded from that particular provision because you had made known your objection and then voted no to go into closed session. But your objection does not mean that you can't otherwise exercise your authority as a representative of the people, so to speak. And so that's the primary reason why we do the roll call vote under the statute for that. In addition, that you can only talk about the topic that you're going into closed session for. Sometimes there's that urge to, well, we're in closed session. What about this other thing? That's not a valid thing to do. You have to limit it to the purposes of that particular discussion. Much was came when we talk about announcing the basis for going into closed session. Much was made earlier. I guess it's not earlier this year. It was last year. In 2025, there was a case out of the city of Marinette. That was the strangest darn case that I've ever seen. It basically involved a member of the Common Council there suing the city because he thought that they violated the open meetings law. And he was a participant in violating the open meetings law. It was the craziest thing I've ever seen. But nonetheless, the court took it up and issued a decision that ultimately reflects the fact that lawyers have this saying that bad facts make bad law typically. This case was one of those, in my opinion, because you had just the goofiest of circumstances. You had a guy that was participating in violating the open meetings law saying, hey, we violated the open meetings law. It's just weird. And so, we get this decision that says, in essence, that bodies need to, and they repeat the language of the statute that you have to publicly announce the legal basis for why you're going into closed session. And then it goes on to suggest that like, there should be like discussion and back and forth, and like everybody should, expressly be, make known that, yeah, we're going to go in closed session because we're going to talk about employment, and that's okay under the statute because the statute says considering employment, promotion, or compensation, and go through this process with every member, and that's the only way you can legally go into closed session. I don't agree with that decision. I think it was just a bad circumstance that made some bad law. But what we've done, and I say we, recognizing that a lot of my colleagues across the state have basically kind of concurred with the opinion and have done, which is what we've started to do is we've included within the public packet for the meetings, a little bit more of a detailed discussion of, hey, this is the closed session that we're using. Here's the intent of why we're going to go into closed session. That way then it's part of the record. The members are reading the discussion that's there. If there were any objections, they would be able to raise the objections and you could have that discussion. But the basis for that in most cases is really pretty clear. Administrator reviews, for example, is one that I can speak pretty intelligently about because we see enough of in here and in other communities. But they're typically communities are going to go into closed session to conduct their reviews of their administrator. Under that 1C approach, again, of considering employment, promotion, compensation, performance evaluation data, like all of those things are part of that good, just good employee review process. You're considering their performance, you're considering whether or not you should continue to employ them or not. Clearly a basis to go into closed session. And so where, maybe previously we said administrator, review, we're going to go into this closed session pursuant to this basis just on the agenda. We've now taken to just adding that additional step of including a little bit of a memo just to highlight a little bit more that, hey, here's the thoughts as to why we should or why you are as a board able to go into closed session. And again, for most of these, it's pretty obvious. If I just say, hey, we're going to go and do a review of the administrator, like that's obvious to most people that, yeah, that's a valid reason. But by just putting that in the packet, it just gives us a little bit more of a detailed basis that we can then, if the courts were to object or get a complaint, that we could point to and say, well, all of the members got the packet. They were able to look at it. The members of the public were able to read the packet. And if anybody had any problems with the idea of why the closed session was appropriate, then they could have raised that. With that said, I just want to talk very briefly about the three closed sessions that I think we most typically see within our governing bodies and other bodies here. The first is, again, that the sub C, which is the consideration of employment, compensation, et cetera. The key there at the end of the day to keep in mind is that provision really talks about a person as opposed to a position. So in other words, you can't go into closed session to talk just generally like, hey, we think that the administrator should be paid $7,000, or whatever the case is, just because it's the administrator. What it does allow you to do is that you can go in and say, I guess I can still, he's still the administrator still today. So I can say, Administrator Kreklo, based on his performance, should be paid $7,000. That you can do because it's about the person specifically. You can't use that to talk about positions just generally. The second one that we see on a regular basis is sub G, which is conferring with legal counsel for the governmental body who is rendering oral or written advice concerning strategy with respect to litigation that it's either in or likely to become involved in. There again, I think the language is pretty obvious of what's there. But again, the concept is that, going in to talk about, maybe, hey, here's the course of action that we're going to take in response to this lawsuit that we, had served on us, or here's my recommendation to you in terms of, a consideration of a settlement, or in the case of, sometimes, police and fire commission, hey, here's some advice for you that you need to know so that you don't get sued by this guy that you're threatening to discipline in some way. Those are all things where the lawyer is involved in providing some advice or guidance to the body that if we went out and publicly and said, hey, we're going to settle this case for, we're willing to do it at $12,000, but start at 30. You kind of shot yourself in the foot because the claimant sitting in the audience and says, oh, well, you were willing to take 12, so I'll take 12. It doesn't work real well that way. So you go into closed session for those purposes. And then the last one that we see on a pretty regular basis is sub E, which is deliberating or negotiating the purchase of public properties, investing in public funds, or whenever competitive or bargaining reasons might require closed session. The takeaways there really are that the reasons to go in closed session have to be the bodies. It can't be because the third party is worried about something. We hear all the time from developers, hey, you got to keep this quiet because we don't want XYZ to know for whatever reason. It's going to drive up prices in the area. It's going to, my competitors are going to know, whatever the case may be. Doesn't matter. Under the open meetings law, the fact that they're worried about some confidential nature of what's going on, not for us to be worried about. It's just part of dealing with government bodies. On the other hand, there are instances where, the fact that we're involved, becomes, important, using the kind of similar, the negotiation strategy. If I'm going to potentially buy a piece of property, I'm going to want to talk in closed session about, hey, what are the potential terms we're willing to live with and what are we not willing to live with? And then provide some direction to staff or to, the parties that are involved to say, hey, here's what you should be doing. If you do all of that in open session, you defeat the purpose of doing it because they're just going to say, well, you were willing to take this, so you should go ahead and do that. And so again, the key is really, again, just that it has to be the body's reasons for going in there. The other thing that provision does is that it can be used to avoid negative comment or negative debate. The fact that something's unpopular is probably all the more reason why it should be public, so that the members of the public are hearing the reasons why you're doing what you're doing. And you can't do it in most cases to avoid any possible competition. You'll see that occasionally from governments that'll say, well, we need to keep the fact that we're negotiating with XYZ corporation quiet because if Richfield hears that we're negotiating with them, they're going to fill up their business park that they've struggled to fill by contacting them and saying, hey, we're gonna give you a better deal. The courts say you can't use that as the basis to go into closed session, primarily because at the end of the day, we don't control it. The fact that we might be negotiating with that corporation, there is nothing that prohibits that corporation from also negotiating with Richfield at the same time. Once you have a deal, obviously that's a different story. But in the negotiation process, they can just as easily go public as we could. And so the courts say that's not a reason to go into closed session. So. Any specific closed session questions anybody has? I mean, we can get really into the weeds on some of the other exceptions, but those are the common ones that we see as part of that. Okay. So with that, we'll just close with the fact that I thank you for your evening, and hopefully you learned something. If you have any questions on anything that we've talked about today, if you just want more guidance on anything, I'm happy to have a chat with any member of any body to explain things, or maybe you don't have questions now, but you find yourself in a circumstance. Hey, how should we deal with this? I'm happy to provide the guidance. Contact information is there on the screen. In addition, oftentimes if it's something that I've not faced before, or even sometimes when it is something that I've faced before, but I just want to confirm that I'm not, losing my mind sometimes, the Attorney General here in Wisconsin provides compliance guides on both the open meetings and open records law. I used to be able to just say, you just go to this page on the website, and unfortunately we can't do that anymore because they got rid of the website that housed all of the open records and open meeting stuff, and instead created this provision that basically you got to go to the menu on the end, and then each one has its own individual open meetings and open records, and they're separate, and so you have to kind of navigate through as part of it. If you do have the printed packet, the web link to the open meetings compliance guide is actually in the printed packet as part of that, so you can look at that too. But you can just go to the general website and do that as well. So, yep.
Subcommittee. Subcommittees for.
Yeah, subcommittees at the end of the day are just committees or subunits that are created by the parent body, and unless there is some prohibition that says you can't do it for some reason, and I can't think of anybody that's true of, the unit is free to create subunits as part of that, recognizing and well, actually she's gone now, but as Trustee Miller learned that sometimes when you create subcommittees with the idea that it's going to be easier, sometimes it makes it harder because you got to do all of the things that you were otherwise doing, publishing notices and having agendas and all that kind of stuff, and so it doesn't necessarily save save any effort. And I guess with that, I'll just close with, what the courts routinely tell us, which is that, the open meetings law is not made for the convenience of us. It's made for the fact that government needs to be transparent and open in all that it does. And so the fact that it's a little bit inconvenient for us in terms of operations sometimes is kind of the point. So with that, thank you. Yep. Yes, ma'am.
Bring it to the village, speak it.